Hey guys, so I've been playing Branded DESPIA for the last little while, and so anytime I come across like a new ruling situation or let's say like a new line of play as I'm playing this deck myself, I like to write things down and then kind of share them in a video like this. So at this point we're at part 3, you can definitely go check out parts 1 and 2. Whether you play Branded DESPIA or you don't play it, you know, if you're, let's say you're going against it, I think this will also help as well. So definitely also if you're interested in recent Branded DESPIA deck lists, I brought one myself. I topped the remote regional with it, and I'm sure there's a lot more other great deck lists floating around there. So anyways, let's just get right into the video. Alright, so let's just get on with the first example, and this is going to be a very niche scenario, and of course we are at part 3 tips, so you know, there's only so much you can cover. Also, shout out to Dragon Shield, by the way. Really like the Lagoon color. You can use my code Hakuna5 for 5% off. Anyways, let's just say in this situation you have a Mirrorjade, you do have an Albaz engraved, and you also happen to have a Mercury in the hand. So let's say your opponent does something that is about to threaten, you know, whether banish or send or whatever, remove the Mirrorjade off the field. So at this point, one of the things you could do is, like, for one, of course, chaining Mirrorjade effect, and let's just say we send Rindbrumm in this example, and let's say your opponent doesn't have a response, you can actually chain link 2 right away and the Rindbrumm that you just sent and target the Albaz. And the only reason in this particular scenario where that might come up, where you chain things right away, is that let's just say your opponent might have a Bystial or let's say a DD Crow, in which case before, you know, because at this point Mirrorjade is still on the field, if they try to Bystial or DD Crow this, you still have that Mercury for the monster negate as kind of like a last hurrah for your Mirrorjade basically. And then at this point, you know, your Albaz would summon, this would of course get sent or destroyed or whatever your opponent just did. And so of course chain link 1 you can pitch for that Albaz fusion effect, and also chain link to Mirrorjade for the nuke effect, or you can like switch things around depending on what's priority in terms of chain blocking. But that's just one example that you should know. Okay, so for this next example, another niche scenario is that, you know, for Lulu, you're obviously never going to make hard make this for the most part, but sometimes it actually does come up in a grind situation, because, for example, in this situation, let's say, you know, you already used your Mirrorjade effect last turn, so you cannot use it again this turn, but, you know, keep in mind, Cortesia, of course, aside from its fusion effect, it's also a tuner, so you can actually synchro these two for that 12, and go into Lulu. I have done this in the past, and then if you had the luxury of having Clem, this can trigger and just bring back that Mirrorjade, and now its banish effect is live again. And if you were to use its banish effect because the card's going to leave the extra deck, Lulu is also going to trigger negate a face-up card, and on top of that, all of your guys will get a 500 attack boost, which can help you likely go for game. Now keep in mind, because you synchro summon, obviously you're not going to be able to use Branded Fusion this turn, so just keep that restriction in mind. So now sticking with the Mirrorjade example, keep in mind if it were to get banished off like something like SP, when it does come back, it will still remember that it was fusion summon, which can be important, right? Because basically it has to be fusion summon for its nuke effect to go off, so just keep that in mind. Even if it's temporarily banished, it will still remember that it was fusion summoned. So I guess sticking with like the extra deck generic ones as an example, another thing we do have to now keep an eye out for is Typhon. Unfortunately, this thing is really good against Branded. Essentially, like, one of the ways that we can kind of get out of it is again, it kind of relies on Clem, which is obviously not going to be always there, but when it comes out, you can always like bring that Albaz back, pitch a card, and just basically get rid of it for like a Mirrorjade. So having Clem is really strong against something like Typhon, and you basically have to kind of keep an eye out for Typhon. Like, for example, if your opponent doesn't have many cards up, but they like normal summon something that just seems a little suspicious, like you might be tempted to have to Mirrorjade, like banish that away, or Branded Red, pop that away with Guardian Chimera in case they go into Typhon. But again, that's kind of hard to predict, but at least we do have to be at least mindful of that. So now the next example is, I kind of mentioned this in the deck profile I did recently, is that when you have Tragedy that you can pitch off, you don't always have to feel like you have to kind of use its add effect in terms of when it hits the grave. Most of the time you probably will, but sometimes you already have everything that you need, and it does have that other effect where you can banish it from grave, set a Branded spell trap from the grave, and then so you can only use one of those 2 effects in the same turn, and sometimes it could come up, right? So for example, in this particular situation, because you already have access, you hard drew the Quem, and you're probably only playing 1 Quem. If you play 2 Quem, yeah, honestly, that might be a different story. But let's say in draw phase, you use the opening, and you get you pitch the Tragedy, and you summon something like the Aluber, right? So in this case, of course, you can always go 1-2, but I'm saying in this case, maybe it's not worth it, because let's say you only play 1 Clem. I mean, sure, maybe you play an Adlet, but even then, assuming the other cards in your hand are dead, that won't do anything anyways. And of course, adding another Aluber that you're not going to summon this turn is not going to be that beneficial, but always having some form of hand advantage, of course, is nice as well. I do understand that. But let's say if you only used Aluber's effect and they impermed you here, then you're kind of stuck, right? But at least here you do have the normal Clem. You can dump the Branded Fusion, and then you can banish the Tragedy, set this Branded Fusion, and then activate it, and you can kind of go from there. So that is just one particular scenario where maybe not always shotgunning the Tragedy effect could potentially work out depending on the situation. Alright, so now let's cover some of the fusion restrictions with some of these cards that you will probably see some play, at least for most of these except for Theater, because no one really plays this one. But anyways, these three, Cartesia, Theater, and Banishment, they have to fusion summon level 8 or higher monster, fusion monster, okay? So you cannot just summon like Mud Dragon or Garura with Cartesia just to like trigger off a Lost or let's say trigger off a Quim. You cannot do that. Same thing for Theater, and then for Banishment in particular, I've seen this error being a lot because they just think they can super poly away the opponent's board and just like make like a Garura or Mud Dragon. Again, you cannot do that. It has to be a level 8 or higher fusion monster. These two are actually the opposite. It has to be a level 8 or lower fusion monster for these, whatever this can summon. For the most part, that should not matter in a branded Despia deck. But I guess for, let's say, like Guardian Chimera is probably the only fusion monster that's beyond level 8. But even then, you would never want to summon Guardian Chimera off these guys, even if you were legally able to, just because Chimera, as I mentioned in my part 2 video, it only gains that pop and draw effect. It was fusioned off of a spell, so not through monsters, so that's why you also don't want to summon Cartesia, or rather summon Guardian Chimera off of Cartesia either. So now the next example is something I'll shout out to my commenter Tactational that mentioned this in my deck profile video, is let's say you get Nibiru and you had a Granule on the field. Like, of course, after it gets tributed, you can use the Granule effect to special summon either a Despian extra deck monster or a Dogmatika main deck monster, right? For the most part, you're probably summoning Quem, but let's say you either went through Quem already in that turn, or maybe if there's a different, better target for this particular situation, and that is that you can actually summon out Maximus if you do play it, and then you can just go off with this, send 2 cards from the extra deck, and you can really plus a lot in Branded Despia compared to like any other deck that's out there, other than maybe Branded Chimera is of course another one that's going to be able to do pretty well, but for the most part, Maximus is really insane if you are able to resolve it. So I guess sticking with Maximus, now let's just assume you had used Nadir's Servant that turn. Obviously at that point you are locked out of the extra deck for the rest of the turn, so don't make the mistake I made when I first did this. Basically I had Ash Dragon on the that I sent as part of Maximus, and my opponent had like another monster. Let's just assume for this particular example it was like Nibiru or something. It's a light monster, right? So I had mistakenly used Ash Dragon to summon out the Albas to try to fusion summon with the opponent's monster, but again, remember, you are locked out of the extra deck after Nadir's Servant. You can quickly forget that, especially for some things that happen in the end phase, so definitely don't make that mistake like I did. Learned it the hard way, but you are locked out of the extra deck. So now let's cover a quick example on Bystials. So for the most part, Branded Despia players are probably only playing Serenir and Lobelian. Sometimes they're playing Magnet, but let's say you only play these two. So when you hard draw these two, it really does suck, right? But keep in mind, Lobelian, it can actually summon itself from hand as well. We're probably used to it just coming from the grave only. So if you do find a way to like summon out these Serenir, and you know, obviously this is not engraved, just don't forget that you can still tribute this off from your hand to summon it. Obviously, Serenir triggers, you can send something like, I don't know, Branded Retribution, and then this can get you access to something like Branded Lost, of course. That's kind of like our primary one. So just don't forget that you are a little bit more flexible than you think. Okay, so now lastly, let's cover like end phase triggers, which gets really tricky, especially when it comes to the mirror. And I'm actually going to link you a couple Judges Lounge Facebook posts that I think will be a good example in terms of, you know, kind of the rulings behind this, because I'm obviously not an expert in it myself. But let's say in this particular example, one of the common things that might come up is, let's say your opponent has a Mirrorjade nuke effect that they've activated that's going to trigger in the end phase, and you have yourself a Titanic Clad. So of course, you know, you want to like summon out an Albaz, let's say fusion summon away like your opponent's monster, but at the same time, you don't want to do that and then just get nuked away by Mirrorjade, right? So as like, let's assume you're the turn player. So in that moment, then you can actually pass priority to your opponent before using that optional trigger of a Titanic Clad, and in which case, if this is like their only trigger, and it is mandatory, of course, at this point, they are forced to resolve the Mirrorjade nuke, and then now it comes back to you, and now you can actually use this effect to summon out Albaz, and then, you know, like fuse away like your opponent's monster. So just keep those like priority things in mind. Another example, I guess, let's say you are in end phase, you're the turn player, and let's say you know, you use a Titanic Cloud effect. Let's say for whatever reason your opponent Bystials or DD Crows your Cartesia. Obviously it probably would have been better to just get rid of this like before you approached end phase, but for this example, let's just say you're using this effect and then they chain Bystial or DD Crow on Cartesia. You cannot just like chain or something and try to get it back. Cartesia will just get banished and you will not be able to trigger this. They have to be in like open game states for you to like trigger this, for example, so keep that in mind. Now let's say another similar situation, again in the end phase. Let's say you happen to, your opponent has like a monster or something, and you happen to do this effect in the end phase to send Albion. Now on that activation, if your opponent like DD Crows or again Bystials this away, you will not be able to trigger the Albion, just because again it has to be like open game state. If they had waited until, you know, your Mirrorjade resolved, then as turn player obviously you're going to be able to trigger this, but in this instance you activated, sent this for cost, and at that point they chained to banish this. Again, you will not be able to trigger Albion in this example. And again, I'll definitely link those Facebook posts that I think you should definitely check out if you're still confused about this, because I know I'm not like an expert, as I mentioned already, and I still have a lot to learn when it comes to these kind of like end phase triggers. Alright guys, so that was it for part 3 of the tip video. Hopefully that was helpful. Definitely let me know in the comments if you have any other tips that you'd like to share. Again, you can definitely go check out parts 1 and 2 in case you missed that as well. And also as well as my recent deck list that I provided, which I did make some slight changes to, but maybe I'll bring another updated profile later in the future. Huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support, and well, Happy New Year and take care guys.